Willa Broadnax was standing at the podium in the Fellowship Hall of Mount Calvary Progressive Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama on a Wednesday evening in November, midway through what was supposed to be a routine financial update before the Deacon board and the trustee ministry, when Deacon Wendell Pruitt stood up from his seat in the second row and said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, "Willa, before you go any further, I think this congregation deserves to know why. There is a $41,000 shortfall in the building fund that you have been personally responsible for managing, and the room, which had been half listening to Willa read quarterly figures off a printed sheet, went completely silent, and Willa set the sheet down on the podium and looked at Wendell Pruitt, a man she had sat across the finance table from twice a month for 11 years, a man whose children she had watched grow up in the same Sunday school rooms as her own, and she said, calmly, "Deacon Pruitt, I would be glad to walk through the building fund figures with you and with anyone else in this room right now." And Wendell said, with the specific practiced concern of a man who has rehearsed this moment more than once, "Willa, nobody here wants to make this ugly. We just need to understand where the money went." And Pastor Reuben Castello, seated at the head table, said, "Willa, perhaps it would be best if you step back from the books until this is sorted out." And Willa, standing at that podium with 40 faces turned toward her, some confused, some already quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about her, felt the specific vertigo of watching 11 years of trusted service become, in the space of 90 seconds, a question mark hanging over her name, and she said, "Pastor, I am not going to step back from anything, because I have not done anything wrong, and I can prove it, and stay with me, because what Willa Broadnax had in a fireproof filing cabinet in the small home office of the house she shared with her husband Theo, 3 miles from that fellowship hall, was the reason that Wendell Pruitt's accusation, an accusation he had spent nearly 4 months carefully preparing to make, was about to become the exact instrument of his own undoing, and what Wendell Pruitt did not know. Standing in that fellowship hall believing he had just successfully redirected 4 months of mounting suspicion onto the one person least likely to be believed over him, was that Willa Broadnax had been keeping her own complete, independent, meticulously dated copy of every single financial record that passed through that church for the entire 11 years she had served as financial secretary, not because she suspected Wendell Pruitt specifically, but because of something a woman named Odessa Vance had told her in a diner in Bessemer, Alabama, 14 years earlier, before Willa had ever set foot inside Mount Calvary at all. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us, if you were publicly accused in front of your entire church community of stealing money you never touched, what would your very first move be? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. Willa Broadnax was born Willa Farrell in Bessemer, Alabama in 1972 and grew up the daughter of a steelworker father and a mother who kept the books for a small black-owned funeral home in the neighborhood, and Willa absorbed, from watching her mother work at the kitchen table most evenings with a ledger and a calculator, a very specific relationship to numbers, which was that numbers, unlike people, did not lie, did not change their story under pressure, did not have an interest in being believed. They simply were what they were, and if you wrote them down correctly and kept them safe, they would tell the truth for you even when you were not in the room to say it yourself. Her mother used to tell her, closing the ledger each evening, that a book that balances is the closest thing to a clear conscience a person can hold in their own 2 hands. Willa studied business administration at a community college in Birmingham while working part-time as a teller at a credit union, learning the specific discipline of a cash drawer that had to balance to the penny at the end of every single shift, no exceptions, no rounding, no benefit of the doubt. And by the time she was 26, she had built a quiet, competent career in bookkeeping and financial administration, working first for a small medical practice and later for a regional nonprofit that served families in the Birmingham area. And it was at that nonprofit, in 1997, that Willa met Odessa Vance, a 61-year-old woman who had spent the previous 20 years serving as the financial secretary of a different Bessemer church before retiring from that role under circumstances that Odessa did not discuss easily and did not discuss at all in Willa's first 2 years of knowing her. Willa and Odessa worked together at the nonprofit for 3 years before Odessa retired fully, and in that time Odessa became something between a mentor and a friend to Willa, teaching her not just the technical mechanics of nonprofit and church bookkeeping, but the specific unwritten realities of the work that no manual ever covered. How to reconcile a discrepancy without accusing anyone before you were certain. How to keep a paper trail that told its own story clearly enough that you never had. To raise your voice to be believed. And there was a particular afternoon, roughly 2 years into their working relationship, on a slow Friday when the office had closed early, when Odessa took Willa to lunch at a diner in Bessemer with red vinyl booths and told her, over coffee, the real story of why she had left her church bookkeeping position. A story Willa had asked about gently twice before and had twice watched Odessa change the subject. Odessa explained that afternoon that she had served faithfully for nearly 2 decades at that Bessemer church, that she had trusted the pastor and the deacon board completely, that she had kept the church's official books meticulously, balanced to the penny every single month for 19 years, but had never once thought to keep a personal, independent copy of anything. Because why would she? She trusted the people she worked alongside the way you trust family. And then, in her 19th year, a shortfall had appeared in a building fund, not unlike the one that would appear at Mount Calvary a quarter-century later. And the deacon who had actually created that shortfall through his own misuse of church credit accounts had moved, quickly and effectively, to suggest that Odessa herself was responsible, and Odessa, with no independent records of her own. Nothing beyond the church's official books which the deacon and his allies on the board had access to and, Odessa suspected though, could never prove, had quietly altered before the accusation was made, had no way to definitively clear her own name. Her voice caught. Willa remembers, telling this part of the story, and she said, "Willa, I sat in that pastor's study and I told him the truth, and he looked at me with real sadness in his eyes, and he still asked me to resign. Because the deacon had numbers on his side, altered numbers, but numbers all the same. And I had nothing but my own word, and my word, it turned out, was not enough." Odessa told Willa, that afternoon in the diner, something that Willa would carry with her for the rest of her career. She reached across the table and took Willa's hand and said, "Baby, I am not telling you this because I think you will ever face what I faced. I am telling you because you might, and if you do, I want you to have what I did not have," she said, "from this day forward. In any position where you are responsible for someone else's money, you keep your own copy of everything, every deposit slip, every check register, every reimbursement request, every bank statement. You photograph it, you file it, you date it, and you keep it somewhere nobody but you can reach, not because you expect to need it, but because the day you need it is never a day you will see coming in advance." And Willa, 28 years old at the time, had listened to this advice with the specific seriousness of someone receiving something she instinctively understood was important even before she fully understood why. She asked Odessa if she had ever considered fighting the resignation, taking it further, and Odessa said she had been 58 years old with a husband recently retired and a mortgage still owed, and fighting would have meant a public battle. She had no documentation to win and no financial cushion to survive. And she had chosen, instead, quiet exit and a private grief that had never fully left her. And Willa had never once, in the 25 years that followed that lunch, allowed the habit Odessa gave her to lapse. Willa began serving as financial secretary at Mount Calvary Progressive Baptist Church in 2013, recommended for the position by a friend from her own congregation who knew the church was searching for someone trustworthy after a period of financial disorganization under a previous volunteer. And Willa approached the role with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. She reorganized the church's entire filing and reconciliation system in her first 6 months, built relationships with the church's vendors and the bank where its accounts were held, and became, over the following years, the specific kind of quietly indispensable presence that a well-run church finance office depends on. There was a moment in her second month, Willa has told me, that she has always considered a small confirmation that Odessa's advice was not paranoia, but simple professional wisdom. A ministry leader had disputed a reimbursement amount Willa had processed, insisting she had shortchanged him. And Willa had been able to produce, within minutes, her own dated copy of his original request showing the exact figure he had submitted, resolving the disagreement instantly, and without any hard feelings on either side. A small moment that nonetheless taught her, concretely and early, exactly what Odessa meant about records speaking for you when your own memory or another person's insistence might otherwise create doubt. She attended every Deacon board meeting. She prepared clear and accurate quarterly reports that board members regularly praised for their clarity, and from her very first month in the role, exactly as Odessa had instructed her, she maintained, in a locked fireproof filing cabinet in her own home office, a complete independent copy of every financial document that passed through her hands, every deposit slip, every reimbursement request submitted by any deacon or ministry leader, every bank statement, every invoice, organized by month and by year, a practice that took her, by her own estimate, an additional 3 to 4 hours a week beyond what the position formally required. Time she gave without complaint and without ever mentioning to anyone at Mount Calvary that she was doing it. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because, as she has told me, explaining it would have required explaining Odessa's story, and Odessa's story was not Willa's to tell. Deacon Wendell Pruitt had joined the Deacon Board at Mount Calvary in 2016, 3 years after Willa began her role, and he brought to that position the specific charisma and social capital of a man who had built a successful independent insurance brokerage in Birmingham and who moved through the congregation with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being trusted. He was generous publicly, funding a portion of the youth ministry's annual retreat out of his own pocket in his second year on the board, a gesture that earned him considerable goodwill, and he was, by the account of nearly everyone at Mount Calvary who knew him in those early years, a genuinely engaged and hard-working deacon, chairing the trustee ministry's building committee when the church began planning a major sanctuary renovation and expansion in 2019, a role that gave him direct oversight of significant contractor relationships and expenditure decisions related to the building fund, what almost nobody at Mount Calvary knew, because Wendell was careful and prideful enough never to let it show in his public presentation, was that his insurance brokerage had been under real and mounting financial strain since 2019, a costly divorce settlement finalized that same year combined with 2 years of declining commission revenue during a period when several of his largest client accounts moved to a competing agency. And Wendell, by his own later account during the criminal proceedings, had told himself in the beginning that he was simply managing a temporary cash flow problem, that he would repay what he borrowed from the building fund reimbursements once his business stabilized, a rationalization that dissolved, year over year, as the business never fully stabilized and the amounts he had already taken grew too large to easily reverse without drawing exactly the kind of attention he was desperate to avoid. What began, according to bank records that would only become fully legible in retrospect, sometime in late 2020, was a pattern that Wendell Pruitt structured with the same careful attention he brought to his own insurance business. He began submitting reimbursement requests for building fund expenses, contractor deposits, materials purchases, permit fees, that were routed through his own insurance brokerage's business account before being forwarded, in modified form, to the church for repayment. A structure that allowed him to inflate the actual costs by amounts that were individually modest, often only a few $100s on any given invoice, but that accumulated, across dozens of transactions over nearly 4 years, into a very significant sum. He was careful to keep his falsified documentation internally consistent, matching invoice numbers and dates in ways that would satisfy a cursory review. And he had, correctly as it turned out, calculated that the church's finance office, meaning Willa, processed the volume of paperwork the building project generated without the specific forensic scrutiny that his scheme depended on going unnoticed. Willa, for her part, processed Wendell's reimbursement requests exactly as she processed every other financial document that came through the church, accurately, on schedule, and, following the practice Odessa had instilled in her, kept a complete independent copy of every single one of them, every invoice, every reimbursement check, every piece of documentation Wendell submitted, filed and dated in the same fireproof cabinet where 14 years of records already lived. She had no specific suspicion of Wendell during these years. She has told me he was, in every interaction she had with him, professional and pleasant, and the specific reality of a well-run finance office is that a scheme like the one Wendell was running is not designed to be caught by the person processing the paperwork. It is designed to only become visible when someone eventually looks at the full pattern across time, which is precisely the kind of review that Willa's own independent filing system, without either of them knowing it, was quietly making possible. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now because this story is about to show you exactly what happened when the shortfall in the building fund finally became impossible to ignore. And you need to be here for what happens next. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever watched someone in a position of trust in your own community get accused of something you suspected they did not actually do? Drop your answer below because we want to hear from you before this story is over. The shortfall became visible in the summer of 2025 when Mount Calvary's Finance Committee, preparing for a final capital campaign push to complete the last phase of the sanctuary renovation, commissioned a comprehensive review of the building fund's total expenditures against its total contributions, a routine step that any well-managed capital campaign requires before a final fundraising push. And the review, conducted initially by a committee of 3 trustees working from the church's official financial records, the same records Willa maintained and submitted regularly, revealed a discrepancy of just over $41,000 between what had been contributed to the building fund since 2019 and what could be accounted for in completed construction work and documented expenditures, a gap that, to a committee of trustees without specialized forensic accounting training, appeared most naturally attributable to the person who had processed every single transaction that fed into those official records. Willa Broadnax, the committee chair, a well-meaning but financially inexperienced trustee named Harold Beeks, brought the preliminary finding to Pastor Castello privately in late September, describing it, in Willa's later recollection of how the conversation had been relayed to her, as troubling but almost certainly explainable. And it was that same week that Wendell Pruitt, learning of the discrepancy through his own seat on the Finance Committee, began the specific work of ensuring that whatever explanation eventually emerged would not point toward him. Wendell Pruitt, who understood exactly what the review would find because he understood exactly what he had done, moved quickly once the committee's preliminary findings began circulating among the Deacon board in early October. He began, in private conversations with individual deacons and eventually with Pastor Castello himself, raising what he framed as concerned questions about Willa's recent handling of the building fund, suggesting, always carefully, always framed as reluctant concern, rather than accusation, that perhaps the finance office had grown too comfortable, too unsupervised, over the years, that perhaps it was worth examining whether Willa's own bookkeeping had been as careful as everyone had assumed. And these suggestions, coming from a respected deacon who had personally funded youth ministry programs and chaired the building committee with what appeared to be genuine dedication, found a receptive audience among board members who had no independent reason to doubt him and who were, understandably, alarmed by a $41,000 gap that needed an explanation. Pastor Reuben Castello, 63 years old and in his 11th year leading Mount Calvary, had known Willa for the entire duration of her service and had, by his own later admission, genuinely trusted her. But he was also a man facing significant pressure from a deacon board increasingly convinced that a serious problem existed and increasingly persuaded by Wendell Pruitt's carefully calibrated concern that the problem originated with the church's bookkeeper, and Reuben made the decision, in the days before the Wednesday evening meeting that opened this story, to allow the matter to be raised formally and publicly rather than address it privately with Willa first, a decision he would later describe, with visible regret, as the single greatest failure of pastoral judgment in his 11 years leading the congregation. The Wednesday evening confrontation unfolded exactly as it opened this story. Wendell's public accusation, the pastor's suggestion that Willa step back from her duties, and Willa's calm, immediate refusal. And what happened in the days that followed that confrontation is the specific sequence that Willa has described to me as the most important 8 days of her professional life. She went home that Wednesday evening, sat down with Theo at their kitchen table, and told him everything that had happened. And Theo, who had watched his wife maintain her independent filing system for the entire 11 years of her service at Mount Calvary without ever quite understanding, until that evening, exactly why it mattered so much to her, said, "Willa, you have been ready for this exact moment for 11 years without knowing it. Now go get the files." Willa spent the following 4 days, taking time off from her regular employment to do it, systematically organizing her complete independent records of the building fund from 2019 forward, every deposit, every expenditure, every reimbursement request submitted by every single person who had drawn against that fund, including, critically, every reimbursement request submitted by Wendell Pruitt himself. Her dining room table disappeared entirely under carefully sorted stacks of paper, months. Labeled on index cards, Theo bringing her coffee and sandwiches, she mostly let go cold. And as she laid the documents out chronologically across that table, cross-referencing her own copies against the official church records the committee had reviewed, a pattern began to emerge that she had never had occasion to look for before because she had never had a reason to examine 4 years of transactions as a single continuous sequence rather than as individual monthly entries processed one a day. Time in the ordinary rhythm of her work, on the third night, close to midnight, she found the first clearly matched discrepancy. A contractor invoice for drywall materials that Willa had filed in March of 2022 showing one amount, and the reimbursement request Wendell had submitted to the church for that same invoice showing a figure nearly $400 higher. And she sat very still at her table for a long moment. And then she kept going, because Odessa had taught her that you do not draw a conclusion from one data point. You follow the pattern until the pattern either disappears or confirms itself completely. And by the end of the fourth day, it had confirmed itself completely. Wendell's reimbursement requests, when placed against the actual contractor invoices Willa had also independently retained, showed a consistent pattern of inflation. Amounts on the copies submitted to the church that did not match the amounts on the original contractor documentation routed through an intermediary account belonging to Wendell's own insurance brokerage. Willa called Theo's cousin, a Birmingham attorney named Gloria Renfield who occasionally handled matters for the family, not to retain her formally, but to ask her advice on how to proceed. And Gloria, after reviewing what Willa had assembled, told her plainly that what she was looking at appeared to be clear evidence of financial misconduct by someone other than herself, and that the appropriate next step was not to confront Wendell Pruitt directly or to present the findings informally, but to request that Mount Calvary's leadership retain an independent, credentialed forensic accountant to conduct a formal review, using Willa's own records as a starting point, but verifying everything through independent means so that the conclusion would carry unquestionable authority regardless of who had first assembled the underlying documentation. Willa requested a meeting with Pastor Castello 8 days after the Wednesday evening confrontation, and she brought with her not accusations but a specific, calm request that the church retain an independent forensic accountant, at her own expense if necessary, to conduct a complete review of the building fund using her personal records as a supplementary resource alongside the official church books, and Reuben, who had spent the previous 8 days growing increasingly uneasy about the speed and certainty with which the accusation against Willa had been allowed to take hold, agreed immediately, and the church retained a Birmingham forensic accountant named Desmond Faulkner, a man with 15 years of experience specifically in nonprofit and religious institution financial reviews, to conduct the examination. Desmond Faulkner spent 6 weeks reviewing every document Willa provided, both the official church records and her own independent copies, cross-referencing bank statements, contractor invoices obtained directly from the contractors themselves rather than from any party's internal copies, and every reimbursement request submitted during the 4-year period in question, and his findings, delivered in a formal written report to Pastor Castello and the full Deacon board in early December, were unambiguous. The $41,000 discrepancy in the building fund was attributable, in its entirety, to a consistent 4-year pattern of inflated reimbursement requests submitted by Deacon Wendell Pruitt, routed through his own business account, with amounts that did not match the actual invoices from the contractors and vendors involved. Invoices that Desmond had independently verified directly with those contractors and vendors rather than relying on any documentation provided by either Willa or Wendell, and Desmond's report specifically noted that Willa Broadnax's own independent record-keeping, maintained consistently and without gaps across the entire period under review, had been essential to establishing the clear and unambiguous timeline that made the pattern impossible to dispute. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now because this story is about to show you exactly what happened when Desmond Faulkner's report was presented to the full Deacon board. And you need to be here for this part. Tell us in the comments. Do you think Wendell Pruitt believed he would never be caught? Or do you think he was simply confident that his standing in the community would protect him even if questions arose? Drop your answer below because we want to hear from you before this story is over. The Deacon Board meeting where Desmond Faulkner presented his findings took place on a Thursday evening in mid-December, in the same fellowship hall where Wendell had made his original accusation 2 months earlier, and Wendell Pruitt, who had been informed only that the forensic review had been completed and would be presented, arrived at that meeting still operating, according to 2 deacons who spoke with me, under the apparent belief that the review would confirm suspicion of Willa rather than expose him directly. He had even, one of those deacons recalled, made a passing comment in the parking lot beforehand about finally getting this whole unfortunate business behind them, and Desmond Faulkner walked the board through his findings methodically, invoice by invoice, projected on a screen at the front of the same room, showing the side-by-side comparison between what contractors had actually charged and what Wendell had submitted for reimbursement, 31 separate discrepancies across 4 years, each one individually small enough to explain away, together forming a picture that required no interpretation at all, and the room, according to those same deacons, experienced a silence considerably heavier than the one that had followed Wendell's original accusation of Willa 2 months earlier. Willa herself was not present for this particular meeting, having been asked by Pastor Castello to wait at home while the board reviewed the findings, and she has told me that waiting by her phone that evening, not knowing exactly what was happening in that room, was in some ways harder than the confrontation itself had been, and Wendell, when finally asked directly by Pastor Castello whether he had any explanation for the discrepancies Desmond had documented, did not deny the pattern outright. He sat for a long moment, according to the deacons present, before he said that he had been personally covering certain project cost overruns out of his own pocket and had simply structured the reimbursements to recover those personal expenditures, an explanation that Desmond, still present in the room, noted directly contradicted the documented invoice amounts from the contractors themselves, who had confirmed, independently and in writing, the actual costs of every phase of the project. And one deacon, a longtime friend of Wendell's named Odessa Vance, asked him quietly, "Wendell, why didn't you just come to the board and ask for help if the business was struggling?" And Wendell, according to Odessa, had no answer for that question at all. Wendell Pruitt resigned from the Deacon board that same evening, before any formal vote to remove him could take place, and the matter was referred, at the recommendation of Gloria Renfield, who Willa brought back in at this stage in a more formal advisory capacity, to the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office for review, given the scale and duration of the documented financial misconduct and criminal proceedings, which were ongoing at the time this story was documented, would eventually result in a plea agreement requiring Wendell to make full restitution to the church alongside a period of probation, an outcome Willa has told me she takes no particular satisfaction in beyond the simple fact that the truth, once it was finally examined completely and carefully, was allowed to stand on its own. Pastor Ruben Castello called Willa personally the day after Wendell's resignation and asked to meet with her privately. And in that meeting, held in his study rather than in front of the congregation, he told her directly that he had failed her, that he had allowed 11 years of trusted service to be outweighed, in the space of a single Wednesday evening, by the confident concern of a man he should have questioned far more carefully before ever allowing the accusation to be raised publicly. And he offered to make a formal public statement to the congregation clearing her name completely and acknowledging the church's failure in how the matter had been handled, and Willa accepted the offer, though she has told me that the private apology in his study, the specific acknowledgement of what had actually gone wrong and why, mattered considerably more to her than anything said publicly afterward, because it was the moment someone in a position of real authority over her professional life had finally examined the situation with the same care she had always brought to the numbers themselves. Willa Broadnax is 53 years old now and continues to serve as financial secretary at Mount Calvary, a role the church's leadership, in the aftermath of everything that happened, formalized with additional structural safeguards Willa herself helped design. including a requirement that any deacon or ministry leader submitting expense reimbursements over a certain threshold provide documentation directly verified by a second independent party, a policy Willa proposed not out of any lingering suspicion of any specific individual, but out of the same practical instinct that had protected her for 11 years, the understanding that good systems protect everyone, including and especially the people who would never think to protect themselves. The congregation, in the months following Wendell's resignation, showed her a kind of visible warmth Willa has described as almost harder to sit with than the accusation itself had been, members she had known for years approaching her after service to apologize for having quietly wondered, in those first confused 90 seconds in the fellowship hall, whether the accusation might be true, and Willa has told me she received every one of those apologies with grace because she understood, in a way that took her some time to arrive at, that the doubt itself had not been a betrayal. It had simply been what an accusation delivered with enough confidence by someone with enough standing will always produce in people who have no independent way to evaluate it, which was, she has come to believe, the entire and precise lesson of everything that had happened. She told me that the thing she thinks about most from the entire experience is not the Wednesday evening confrontation and not the 6 weeks of Desmond Faulkner's review. The thing she thinks about most is a diner in Bessemer, Alabama in 1999 and a woman named Odessa Vance, who she has stayed close to for over 2 decades since, who cried, Willa has told me. When Willa called her the week after Wendell's resignation to tell her that the filing cabinet had finally done exactly what Odessa had told her, all those years ago, it might someday need to do. Odessa, now 86 years old and living in an assisted living facility outside Bessemer, asked Willa on that phone call whether she still had the fireproof cabinet, and Willa told her yes, fuller now than it had ever been, and Odessa said, keep filling it, baby. You never know whose story you might end up saving besides your own, a comment Willa has taken literally. She now mentors 2 younger women in bookkeeping and financial administration roles at other Birmingham area churches and nonprofits, and the first thing she tells each of them, in almost the exact words Odessa used with her in that diner booth 26 years earlier, is to start their own fireproof filing cabinet on their very first day in the role, whether they think they will ever need it or not. Here is what stays with me about Willa Broadnax. Wendell Pruitt spent 4 years building a scheme that depended entirely on a specific and reasonable assumption that the person processing his paperwork would never have the occasion, the reason, or the independent documentation necessary to notice a pattern spread carefully across dozens of individually modest transactions over years. And when the shortfall finally became impossible to ignore, he made a second calculation, that his own standing in the congregation, his generosity, his visible dedication to the building project he was quietly defrauding, would make him considerably more believable than the woman whose only defense, in the absence of independent records, would have been her own word against his. And this second calculation was not, it must be said, an unreasonable one to make. It had worked for the deacon who accused Odessa Vance a quarter-century earlier, and it very nearly worked again in that fellowship hall. On a Wednesday evening in November, for the first 90 seconds it worked exactly as Wendell had planned, and what Wendell Pruitt could not have accounted for, because Willa had never once mentioned it to anyone at Mount Calvary in 11 years of faithful service, was a promise she had made to herself in a Bessemer diner a quarter-century earlier. After listening to a woman who had lived through exactly what Willa was now facing and had lacked the one thing that could have saved her, the specific and unglamorous discipline of keeping your own complete record of the truth, filed and dated and ready, for a day you never expect to come and hope you never need. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about Pastor Castello. He allowed a public accusation to proceed against a woman who had served faithfully for 11 years, based largely on the confident concern of a man with less tenure and less demonstrated trustworthiness. Do you think his failure was a reasonable response to genuine pressure from his board? Or do you think a pastor has a specific responsibility to protect the people under his spiritual and professional care that he clearly failed to meet? And the second question is about Willa's decision to maintain independent records for 11 years without ever telling anyone at her church she was doing it. Do you think that level of quiet, sustained precaution is simply wise professional practice that more people should adopt? Or do you think there is something worth examining about a world where a woman of complete integrity has to spend decades preparing for an accusation she hopes never comes? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to produce a comment conversation that runs for a very long time. If this story made you think about the records you keep or should be keeping, in any role where you are trusted with something that matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button if Willa Broadnax reminded you of someone you know. And subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.